Margaret Chen stood in the cramped office of Coldbrook Realty, staring at the property listing one more time. The photograph showed a deteriorating gas station on the edge of Millbrook, Nebraska, a town of barely 3,000 people, where everyone knew everyone else's business. The pumps were gone. The windows were boarded. The building itself looked like it had been slowly rotting since the 1970s. The price tag was a bare whisper, $47,000. Her sister Patricia had been the first to laugh when Margaret mentioned it at family dinner 2 weeks ago. Patricia, who drove a Range Rover and lived in a glass box of a house in the Omaha suburbs, had actually laughed. "You're going to buy a dead gas station? With what money? Your antique shop barely breaks even." Patricia's husband Kevin had chimed in with something about it being a money pit and a waste. And Margaret had felt the familiar sting of being the family's unrealistic dreamer, the one who never quite managed to be as successful as her more conventionally ambitious siblings. But Margaret had always trusted her instincts. She had a feeling about this place. She couldn't explain it. And when the real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Brenda who wore too much perfume, had asked her what attracted her to the property, Margaret had struggled to articulate it. "It just feels like there's a story here," she'd finally said. And Brenda had given her the practiced smile people reserve for those they suspect of being slightly unbalanced. The gas station had originally been built in 1947, and according to the county records. It had operated continuously for 42 years before the owner, a man named Harold Matheson, had closed it in 1989. Harold had died 5 years later. The property had changed hands twice since then, and both times the new owners had listed it, failed to find serious buyers, and eventually let it go to a property management company that collected property taxes and not much else. When Margaret had asked Brenda why it seemed so difficult to move, Brenda had simply shrugged and said, "Small towns like Millbrook are dying. Everybody's heading to the cities. The land isn't worth much because there's no development happening. No jobs, no future." Those words had sparked something in Margaret instead of discouraging her. And she'd driven to Millbrook on a Saturday morning and sat in her car across from the station for an hour, just looking. The building had been pale blue once, maybe. Now the paint was peeling in long strips. There was a single rusted car parked around back, probably left by one of the previous owners. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, sagging in places, and the lot was overgrown with prairie grass and dandelions that had turned to seed. What had made her feel something was the way the building sat on the lot. It seemed to settle there with weight and purpose. She could imagine what it must have looked like in the 50s, bright and new, people stopping to fill up their cars with hope about where they were heading. Now it looked abandoned, yes, but not hopeless. Patient. Waiting. She had made the offer 2 days later, when the property management company had accepted immediately. Margaret had closed 3 weeks later with money from her savings and a small business loan. Patricia had called her that evening. "Mom's very worried," Patricia had said, which was code for, "I'm very worried and Mom agrees with me." "The station needs work," Margaret had replied carefully. "It's an investment." "In what?" "Margaret, that property has been sitting empty for decades. If there was money in it, someone would have developed it already. You're throwing away your retirement savings." But Margaret had already made her decision. She'd spent 30 years building a small antique shop in a strip mall in Lincoln, carefully restoring old furniture, hunting through estate sales for treasures. She'd learned that value wasn't always obvious at first glance. A chair that looked like garbage might have beneath it the signature of a master craftsman. A painting in a cracked frame might be a legitimate work of art. The world was full of dismissed things waiting to be appreciated again. Why should a property be any different? The first month, she focused on basic cleanup. She hired a crew to clear the lot, remove the abandoned car, cut back the prairie grass. She had the septic system inspected. It worked, to her surprise. The electrical lines were still live. The roof needed work but wasn't actively leaking in most places. The plumbing was ancient but serviceable. A local contractor named Jerome gave her an estimate of $18,000 for a basic restoration. Jerome was maybe 60, a man who'd lived in Millbrook his entire life, and he seemed genuinely baffled by her project. "What are you planning to do with it?" he asked one afternoon as he walked the perimeter, marking down what needed fixing. "I'm not sure yet," Margaret admitted. "Maybe a small antique shop. Maybe convert it into something else. Depends what I find as I'm opening it up." Jerome had stopped walking and turned to look at her directly. "You going to be careful in the back?" he asked. "The compressor room? You been in there yet?" Margaret hadn't. The interior wasn't yet stabilized enough to spend time inside. There was standing water in the bays, mold in the corners, and she was waiting on Jerome to do the initial assessment before she pushed deeper. "Not yet," she said. "Is there something I should know about it?" Jerome had a strange expression on his face, something between caution and excitement. "Harold Matheson used to be particular about that room," he'd said slowly. "Back when the station was operating, he'd keep it locked. Wouldn't let anyone but himself and his brother back there. Wouldn't even let me in when I needed to service the main compressor line. Made me call Harold directly if I needed anything done, and he'd do it himself. Always seemed to think it was important, that room." "Do you know why?" Margaret had pressed. Jerome had shrugged, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew more than he was saying. Harold wasn't the type to share much about his business. He was a private man, kept things to himself. "But I remember, must have been 1987 or so, the compressor lines needed replacing. I bid on the job. Harold decided to do the work himself rather than let me near that back room. That tells you something." Jerome had finished his inspection and given her the estimate. Margaret had signed the contract the next day. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook that someone from Lincoln had bought the old gas station and was planning to restore it. The reactions had been mixed, but predominantly skeptical. Margaret knew this because Jerome had been kind enough to pass along the comments he heard at the diner. Tom Hendricks, who owned the feed store, had apparently said it was a fool's errand. Linda Kowalski, who ran the bank, had shaken her head and told someone that the land wasn't worth developing. The most interesting reaction had come from Richard Brennan, who owned most of the commercial real estate in Millbrook and had been trying to buy up properties on that side of town for the better part of a decade. And Richard had come to the gas station one afternoon without calling ahead, parking his black BMW in front and walking the perimeter with the expression of a man inspecting something he'd dropped. Margaret had been overseeing some of Jerome's crew working on the roof, but she'd climbed down to meet him. Richard was her age, maybe 52 or 53, with the kind of tan that came from a country club membership and the kind of suit that didn't belong anywhere in Nebraska. "Quite the project," he'd said, extending his hand. Margaret had shaken it, trying not to wipe the dust from her jeans onto his expensive fabric. "I'm Richard Brennan. I own the commercial properties in town. Thought I'd come see what all the fuss was about." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Margaret had learned to recognize that particular expression, and it was the look of someone calculating whether she was a threat or an opportunity. "Margaret Chen," she'd said. "It's a beautiful property. Lots of potential." "Potential," Richard had repeated, his eyes sweeping across the dilapidated building. "That's one word for it. Look, I don't know if anyone's told you, but I've been working on acquiring properties along Highway 14 for the past decade. I had plans for this particular building before the previous owner let it go. If you ever decide you want to sell, I'd be more than happy to make you an offer. A generous one. There had been something in his tone, a certainty that she would eventually come around to his way of thinking. Margaret had felt a flicker of something between annoyance and curiosity. "I'm not planning to sell," she'd said simply. Richard had smiled again, and that same cold smile. Never say never. These projects have a way of becoming money pits. When you're tired of throwing good money after bad, you know where to find me. He'd given her a business card with gold embossing and driven away in his black BMW. 3 weeks into the restoration, Jerome's crew had stabilized the roof and cleared out the worst of the water damage. Margaret had started spending entire days at the station, working side by side with the crew, learning the building's bones. She'd found old ledgers in a filing cabinet, handwritten accounts from the 60s and 70s, recording every gallon of gas sold, every oil change performed. She'd found a coffee tin full of old receipts. A calendar from 1963 still hanging on the office wall, frozen on a day in August. Fragments of a life, pieces of history. Jerome had started showing up regularly, ostensibly to oversee the work, but really, Margaret suspected, because he was becoming as curious as she was. They'd developed an easy-working relationship. He'd tell her stories about Millbrook in earlier decades, about the families who'd run the farms and small businesses along Highway 14. She'd ask questions and listen, and gradually a picture had formed of a place that had been more vibrant once, more connected, more alive. It was a Tuesday morning in the 4th week when Jerome had pulled her aside. They'd been in the Bay Area, surveying the recent work, when he'd looked at the back wall, the wall that backed the compressor room. "You ever think about opening up that back room properly?" he'd asked. "I mean, really opening it up. You've got the roof fixed, the electrical stable, the walls are sound, but nobody's been in there in decades. You think about taking a look?" Margaret had thought about it, actually. She'd thought about it since Jerome first mentioned Harold Matheson's possessiveness about that space. The compressor room was a puzzle, and Margaret had never been able to resist a puzzle. "What would I find?" she'd asked. Jerome had shrugged, but there was something in his expression that suggested he had ideas. Only one way to find out. That afternoon, Margaret had hired a crew to clear the compressor room properly. They'd removed the decades of accumulated junk, old metal cans, broken tools, shelves that had collapsed under their own weight. It had taken 6 hours. By the end of the day, the room was empty except for the main compressor unit, lying still bolted to the floor despite being long disconnected from any gas lines. The pegboard walls were empty, their tool outlines marked in rust-colored shadows. The floor was stained with oil and years. And that was when Jerome, sweeping out the last of the debris, had stopped. He'd been standing against the far wall, and he turned to Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Come here," he'd said. Margaret had crossed the room. Jerome was pointing at the cinder block wall that backed the room, the wall that separated the compressor room from what should have been the exterior of the building. "This wall shouldn't be here," he'd said. "I worked on this station back in 1989, when Harold was still running it. I remember when they did some structural work. The exterior wall is on the other side of those metal shelving units. This wall, this is new, or at least newer. 30 years maybe. But it wasn't always here." Margaret had stared at the wall. He was right. Looking at the spacing, understanding the building's layout, this wall didn't make sense. It was a false wall, built in front of what should have been open space. She'd looked at Jerome. "Do you think—" "I think Harold Matheson built himself a room," Jerome had said quietly. "And I think he didn't want anyone knowing about it." Without giving herself time to second guess, Margaret had hired a contractor, not Jerome, who was too old for the work, but a younger man from the next town over, to carefully remove the false wall. She told the contractor to work slowly, to salvage the bricks, to make sure he didn't disturb whatever might be on the other side, or he'd asked if she was expecting to find bodies. Margaret had laughed. "Only the ghosts of secrets," she'd said. The contractor had looked at her like she was insane, but he'd done the work. It took 3 days. Removing the wall brick by brick, creating an opening just wide enough for a person to slip through. Margaret had watched most of it, tension coiling in her chest, not knowing what she was about to find. Terror and anticipation in equal measure. On the evening of the 3rd day, when the last brick was removed and the opening stood revealed, the contractor had shined his flashlight through. "There's something in there," he'd said. "Lights, wiring, and—" Margaret had held her breath. "And what?" "And what looks like cars. There are cars in there." Margaret's hands had been shaking as she'd pulled on gloves and stepped through the opening. Jerome was behind her. The contractor held the flashlight, and what they found was a sealed room the size of 2 standard garages, hidden for 3 decades behind a false wall. 4 cars sat in the space, their shapes visible beneath heavy canvas covers, their tires flat from years of disuse. Fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling, wired to an old generator in the corner that hadn't run in decades. The walls were lined with pegboard and tool racks, each holding carefully organized equipment. A workbench sat against one wall, and on top of it was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age, waiting. Margaret's heart had been thundering in her chest as she'd crossed to the workbench. Jerome had been murmuring something behind her, his voice hushed. "Incredible," he kept saying. "I can't believe it." Margaret had picked up the journal. The cover was soft with age, the leather supple from decades of care. She'd opened it carefully to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, the pen strokes confident. The date at the top was May 15th, 1960. "It's a restoration log," Margaret had breathed, reading the first entries. Harold was documenting his work. These cars. He was restoring them. He was restoring them all. She'd looked up at Jerome, understanding dawning across her face. He was an artist. He was a car restorer. He built this space so he could work in secret. Jerome had moved to one of the covered vehicles and carefully pulled back the canvas. Beneath it sat a car like nothing Margaret had ever seen. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, pristine and gleaming, its paint a rich burgundy red, its chrome catching the flashlight beam like liquid silver. It looked like it had been built yesterday. "Oh my God," Jerome had whispered. Margaret had moved to the next car, pulling back the cover. A 1961 Jaguar E-Type, British racing green, its curves perfect, its leather interior still supple and dark. The third car was a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, dove gray, its gull-wing doors pristine. And the fourth, when Margaret had pulled away its covering, proved to be a 1952 Rolls-Royce Silver Dawn in cream and silver, its wood trim gleaming like honey. 4 pristine vintage automobiles, restored to museum quality, hidden away in a secret room behind a false wall for over 30 years. Margaret had felt tears in her eyes. "He was a master," she'd said. "He was brilliant and nobody knew." The ledger told the story. Harold Matheson, son of a mechanic, had been born to restore things. But in his small Nebraska town, there had been no market for his gift. So he'd run a gas station, a front, a cover, a way to make a living. And in the hours when no one was watching, in a sealed room behind a false wall, he'd practiced his art. He'd acquired broken cars, damaged vehicles, forgotten machines, and he'd brought them back to life. The journal documented every detail, every bolt tightened, every panel aligned, every moment of restoration work. Decades of passion poured into work that no one would ever see. Harold had died in 1994. The room had remained sealed. The cars had sat in darkness, untouched, untended, waiting. Margaret had spent the next 6 months making calls. She'd contacted auction houses. She'd reached out to classic car dealers. She'd connected with museums. She'd documented everything in the journal, photographed each car in its pristine condition, told the story of the hidden artist and his secret work. The 4 cars had been authenticated as museum-quality restorations, each worth between $50,000 and $200,000. The appraiser who'd examined them had actually cried. He was a genius, the man had said. An absolute genius. The work here is flawless. These aren't just restorations. These are masterpieces. The first car had sold at auction for $185,000. The Jaguar had gone for $165,000. The Mercedes-Benz for $210,000. And the Rolls-Royce, the crown jewel, had sold to a collector in California for $395,000. The total was just over $955,000. Richard Brennan had come to the gas station again, this time 6 months into Margaret's ownership. He'd come to gawk, she realized. News of the discovery had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Everyone who dismissed the purchase, who'd called it foolish, who'd written Margaret off as a dreamer, they'd all heard what she'd found. The whole town knew. Margaret had been standing in the now emptied secret room. She'd decided to turn it into a small museum, displaying the journal, the photographs, the documentation of Harold's work. When Richard had appeared in the opening, his expression was different this time. No cold smile, just envy, pure and simple. "Well," he'd said, his voice tight. "Congratulations." Margaret had simply nodded. She hadn't needed to say anything. They both understood. He'd had the opportunity. He'd had the resources. He'd even been interested in the property. But he'd never looked beyond the surface. He'd seen a dilapidated building in a dying town and calculated nothing but loss. Margaret had seen the same building and trusted her instincts. She'd believed in the possibility of hidden value. And she'd been right. The gas station, Margaret had realized, had never really been about gas. It had been about patience. It had been about believing that beauty could hide beneath the surface, waiting for someone with eyes to see it. Harold Matheson had built his masterpieces and hidden them away, perhaps thinking no one would ever know. But the universe, Margaret believed, had different plans. Value, she'd learned, doesn't announce itself. It waits. It's patient. And it reveals itself only to those who trust their instincts enough to look deeper. And sometimes, the most worthless things turn out to be the most precious.